Picture this. You're lying in a creaking bed as midnight's chill slides over the room like a shy ghost. And the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing you whole is a centuries-old bedtime story. Hey folks, before we drift into dreamland, smash that like button if you've ever tried to fall asleep to a sermon and missed the snooze button, and drop a comment telling me your strangest bedtime ritual. Now dim the lights, pull those cozy blankets tight, and let the faint scent of old parchment and faint incense swirl around you like a lullaby for the soul. You close your eyes and suddenly find yourself on a hilltop in Bethlehem. The night sky a bruised violet canvas, while a newborn's cry pierces the silence like a tiny alarm clock. The wind carries the warm, buttery aroma of fresh figs from a nearby market. Yet, the distant bleating of goats sounds suspiciously like your neighbor's late-night karaoke, except less off-key. If that tickles your curiosity, stick around as we untangle the soothing, slightly absurd tales that have lulled generations to sleep. And let me know in the comments which biblical bedtime story you'd swap for a modern Netflix binge. The valley breathed a soft sigh as twilight draped its violet shawl over the hills. And Miriam, a sprightly shepherdess with hair the color of wheat, tended her flock on the slope. A lamb, no ordinary bleater, glowed like a pocket-sized lantern, its fleece shimmering amber in the dying light. Miriam blinked, thinking the creature might have swallowed a firefly, and whispered a bemused, "Whoa. Are you auditioning for a Disney sidekick?" The lamb nudged her palm, its warm nose buzzing with a quiet urgency. Without a word, the shepherdess followed, heart thudding like a drumbeat in a medieval rave. The glow led them through a tumble of bramble, past a stream that smelled of wet stone and minty perfume, until ancient olive trees rose like solemn sentinels. Their gnarled trunks whispered tales of centuries, leaves rustling like the soft murmur of an old cinema projector. Miriam's sandals sank into a carpet of moss that smelt of damp earth, and a hint of goat cheese, pleasantly pungent, like Grandma's pantry. A mischievous breeze tossed the lamb's luminous coat, casting dancing shadows that played tag on the bark. The shepherdess laughed, realizing the meadow had turned into a natural nightclub, and the olives swayed to an unheard soundtrack. From the heart of the grove, a voice unfurled, smooth, warm, and as vast as a desert sunrise, telling the story of creation with the cadence of a storyteller at a campfire. It began with "In the beginning, there was nothing," but then paused for dramatic effect, like a suspenseful Netflix trailer, before painting galaxies onto the night. Light burst like fireworks, stars popped into existence, and the earth sprouted with mud that smelled like freshly turned soil and a dash of burnt incense. The Almighty's narration slipped in jokes, and then God said, "Let there be coffee, because even divine beings need a caffeine kick." Miriam chuckled, feeling the absurdity and awe swirl together like a perfect latte foam. The voice softened, wrapping the valley in a blanket of peace that tasted like honey drizzled figs and the faint tang of night blooming jasmine. Crickets chirped a rhythm that matched Miriam's pulse, their song a low-key percussion section for the celestial symphony. Fireflies twinkled like distant satellites, and the lamb's glow dimmed to a gentle ember, coaxing the shepherdess into a restful hush. Above, the sky unfurled a tapestry of constellations, each star winking like an audience member at a stand-up comedy show. Miriam lay back on the cool grass, feeling the world's worries melt away like butter on warm toast. When the tale wound down, the Almighty's voice lingered like an echo in a canyon, reminding Miriam that every sigh of wind and rustle of leaf carries a fragment of the divine script. She rose, patting the now ordinary lamb, thanking it for the nighttime GPS that led her to wonder. The shepherdess tipped her hat to the olive trees, whispering, "May your roots stay as deep as my Wi-Fi signal," a cheeky nod to modern comforts. With a final glance at the star-sprinkled sky, she walked home, her steps light, her heart full of stories that would soothe future sleepless nights. And somewhere beyond the hills, the meadow kept whispering, promising more luminous adventures for any wanderer brave enough to listen. Miriam slipped her sandal off, feeling the cool night air brush her ankles as the little lamb bobbed ahead like a fuzzy GPS unit, its wool glinting in the silver glow. The lamb's tiny hooves clattered against the soft gravel, sending tiny clouds of dust that twinkled like stray confetti. With each step, the moon rose higher, painting the reeds in a pale lavender hue that smelled faintly of wet earth and distant pine sap. Miriam followed, her heart thumping like a drumline at a high school football game, half excited and half terrified of where the creature might lead. Soon, they reached a river that stretched like a silver ribbon, mirroring the heavens and humming a lullaby only night owls could comprehend. The river's surface flickered with 1,000 stars, each ripple catching a pinprick of light that danced like fireflies on a caffeinated soundtrack. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp moss, and the faint, metallic tang of riverweed, making Miriam feel as if she'd inhaled a secret potion. The water whispered against the banks, a soft susurrus that sounded suspiciously like a grandmother's soothing hum from the days of cassette tapes. As the lamb nudged the water's edge, droplets leapt up, splashing her cheek with a cold kiss that left a grin of surprised delight. In that moment, the world seemed to pause, and the river turned into a living mirror that reflected not only the sky, but also Miriam's own restless spirit. Suddenly, the river spoke, its voice deep and resonant, telling the ancient tale of Noah's Ark as if it were a late-night Netflix documentary narrated by Morgan Freeman. It described how a stubborn woodcutter turned carpenter, a pair of dodos that never existed, and a massive boat that floated like a floating supermarket on a flooded highway. The water recounted the thunder's roar, the rain's relentless patter, and the rainbow that appeared only after the sky stopped throwing tantrums. Miriam imagined the ark's massive wooden ribs creaking under the weight of every animal, from a snoring sloth to a hyperactive hamster on a treadmill. The river's tail wrapped around her like a cozy blanket, reminding her that even the wildest storms can be survived with a pinch of faith and a splash of humor. Each splash against the shore sounded like a drum roll, announcing a promise of rain, echoing the covenant that once fell from the heavens and smelled like fresh cut grass after a summer storm. The babbling water reminded Miriam that patience isn't just waiting, it's the art of listening to the river's slow, steady heartbeat while the world whirls like a blender on puree. She felt the cool current tug at her ankles, urging her to trust the flow, much like a child trusts a roller coaster that screams YOLO. At the top of its first hill, the river's lullaby coaxed her thoughts into a calm so deep that even the rustle of night insects sounded like a jazz sax solo, playing "What a Wonderful World." In that serene chaos, Miriam learned that trusting the unknown can smooth even the fiercest of tempests, just as a well-timed meme can diffuse a tense family dinner. As dawn's pale fingers stretched over the horizon, the river sighed a final note, shimmering like a polished sword ready for a knight's oath. Miriam turned to the lamb, who gave a conspiratorial bleat, as if saying, "We've got this, Captain," and trotted away toward the sunrise with the swagger of a superhero in a cape. The dream-like river faded behind her, leaving a lingering scent of wet stone and a subtle echo that promised future rains and new adventures. She walked home with a heart as light as a feather-filled pillow, confident that patience and trust could calm any storm, even the one that makes you forget where you parked your chariot. And if you ever find yourself by a moonlit river, listen closely. There's a story waiting to be told, complete with splashy sound effects, and a cameo by a wise lamb who knows the GPS settings better than your phone. Miriam tucked the soft blanket of night around her shoulders and followed a tiny lantern that bobbed like a mischievous firefly. It wasn't any ordinary bug. Its glow pulsed with an angel's whisper, casting silver ribbons on the grass. She hummed a sleepy tune, feeling the lantern tug gently, as if an invisible hand were steering a bedtime carousel. The air smelled of pine sap and distant campfires, a comforting perfume that made the stars feel like glittery nightlights. With each step, the world slipped farther from the clamor of daytime, and the lantern's light grew brighter, promising a story worth the yawns. The lantern guided Miriam up a knobby hill where ancient stones hunched like tired grandparents. A cool breeze whispered through the olive trees, rattling dried figs and making the night sound like a lazy sax solo. She could hear a distant brook babbling in a lisp that sounded suspiciously like a bedtime lullaby from a cartoon princess. Above her, the sky flickered with constellations that seemed to wink, as if the universe itself were checking whether anyone had turned off the lights. When she reached the summit, the lantern settled on a smooth rock, its glow spilling over a hidden hollow where the tale of David and Goliath waited to be whispered. In that hollow, a tiny voice rose. David, the shepherd boy with a heart louder than his slingshot, faced a giant the size of a double-decker bus. Goliath's armor clanged like a heavy metal concert. His breath reeked of stale sweat and cheap incense from his war drums. Miriam could almost see the giant's eyes, two dark pits that seemed to swallow sunlight. Yet David's confidence glowed like the lantern itself. The boy's hand steadied on a smooth stone, his fingers brushing the rough surface as if feeling for the perfect note in a song. When the stone flew, it sang a whizzing lullaby that struck Goliath's forehead, and the giant toppled with a thud that rattled the hill like a dropped drum set. The valley breathed a soft sigh as twilight draped its violet shawl over the hills, and Miriam, a sprightly shepherdess with hair the color of wheat, tended her flock on the slope. A lamb, no ordinary bleater, glowed like a pocket-sized lantern, its fleece shimmering amber in the dying light. Miriam blinked, thinking the creature might have swallowed a firefly, and whispered a bemused, "Whoa, are you auditioning for a Disney sidekick?" The lamb nudged her palm, its warm nose buzzing with a quiet urgency. Without a word, the shepherdess followed, heart thudding like a drumbeat in a medieval rave. The glow led them through a tumble of bramble, past a stream that smelled of wet stone and minty perfume, until ancient olive trees rose like solemn sentinels. Their gnarled trunks whispered tales of centuries, leaves rustling like the soft murmur of an old cinema projector. Miriam's sandals sank into a carpet of moss that smelt of damp earth and a hint of goat cheese, pleasantly pungent, like Grandma's pantry. A mischievous breeze tossed the lamb's luminous coat, casting dancing shadows that played tag on the bark. The shepherdess laughed, realizing the meadow had turned into a natural nightclub, and the olives swayed to an unheard soundtrack. From the heart of the grove, a voice unfurled, smooth, warm, and as vast as a desert sunrise, telling the story of creation with the cadence of a storyteller at a campfire. It began with "in the beginning." There was nothing, but then paused for dramatic effect, like a suspenseful Netflix trailer, before painting galaxies onto the night. Light burst like fireworks. Stars popped into existence, and the earth sprouted with mud that smelled like freshly turned soil and a dash of burnt incense. The Almighty's narration slipped in jokes, and then God said, "Let there be coffee, because even divine beings need a caffeine kick." Miriam chuckled, feeling the absurdity and awe swirl together like a perfect latte foam. The voice softened, wrapping the valley in a blanket of peace that tasted like honey drizzled figs and the faint tang of night blooming jasmine. Crickets chirped a rhythm that matched Miriam's pulse. Their song, a low-key percussion section for the celestial symphony. Fireflies twinkled like distant satellites, and the lamb's glow dimmed to a gentle ember, coaxing the shepherdess into a restful hush. Above, the sky unfurled a tapestry of constellations, each star winking like an audience member at a stand-up comedy show. Miriam lay back on the cool grass, feeling the world's worries melt away like butter on warm toast. When the tale wound down, the Almighty's voice lingered like an echo in a canyon, reminding Miriam that every sigh of wind and rustle of leaf carries a fragment of the divine script. She rose, patting the now ordinary lamb, thanking it for the nighttime GPS that led her to wonder. The shepherdess tipped her hat to the olive trees, whispering, "May your roots stay as deep as my Wi-Fi signal," a cheeky nod to modern comforts. With a final glance at the star-sprinkled sky, she walked home, her steps light, her heart full of stories that would soothe future sleepless nights. And somewhere beyond the hills, the meadow kept whispering, promising more luminous adventures for any wanderer brave enough to listen. Miriam slipped her sandal off, feeling the cool night air brush her ankles as the little lamb bobbed ahead like a fuzzy GPS unit, its wool glinting in the silver glow. The lamb's tiny hooves clattered against the soft gravel, sending tiny clouds of dust that twinkled like stray confetti. With each step, the moon rose higher, painting the reeds in a pale lavender hue that smelled faintly of wet earth and distant pine sap. Miriam followed, her heart thumping like a drumline at a high school football game, half excited and half terrified of where the creature might lead. Soon, they reached a river that stretched like a silver ribbon, mirroring the heavens and humming a lullaby only night owls could comprehend. The river's surface flickered with 1,000 stars, each ripple catching a pinprick of light that danced like fireflies on a caffeinated soundtrack. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp moss and the faint, metallic tang of riverweed, making Miriam feel as if she'd inhaled a secret potion. The water whispered against the banks, a soft susurrus that sounded suspiciously like a grandmother's soothing hum from the days of cassette tapes. As the lamb nudged the water's edge, droplets leapt up, splashing her cheek with a cold kiss that left a grin of surprised delight. In that moment, the world seemed to pause, and the river turned into a living mirror that reflected not only the sky, but also Miriam's own restless spirit. Suddenly, the river spoke, its voice deep and resonant, telling the ancient tale of Noah's Ark as if it were a late-night Netflix documentary narrated by Morgan Freeman. It described how a stubborn woodcutter turned carpenter, a pair of dodos that never existed, and a massive boat that floated like a floating supermarket on a flooded highway. The water recounted the thunder's roar, the rain's relentless patter, and the rainbow that appeared only after the sky stopped throwing tantrums. Miriam imagined the ark's massive wooden ribs creaking under the weight of every animal, from a snoring sloth to a hyperactive hamster on a treadmill. The river's tail wrapped around her like a cozy blanket, reminding her that even the wildest storms can be survived with a pinch of faith and a splash of humor. Each splash against the shore sounded like a drum roll, announcing a promise of rain, echoing the covenant that once fell from the heavens and smelled like fresh cut grass after a summer storm. The babbling water reminded Miriam that patience isn't just waiting, it's the art of listening to the river's slow, steady heartbeat while the world whirls like a blender on puree. She felt the cool current tug at her ankles, urging her to trust the flow, much like a child trusts a roller coaster that screams YOLO. At the top of its first hill, the river's lullaby coaxed her thoughts into a calm so deep that even the rustle of night insects sounded like a jazz sax solo playing "What a Wonderful World." In that serene chaos, Miriam learned that trusting the unknown can smooth even the fiercest of tempests, just as a well-timed meme can diffuse a tense family dinner. As dawn's pale fingers stretched over the horizon, the river sighed a final note, shimmering like a polished sword ready for a knight's oath. Miriam turned to the lamb, who gave a conspiratorial bleat, as if saying, "We've got this, Captain," and trotted away toward the sunrise with the swagger of a superhero in a cape. The dream-like river faded behind her, leaving a lingering scent of wet stone and a subtle echo that promised future rains and new adventures. She walked home with a heart as light as a feather-filled pillow, confident that patience and trust could calm any storm, even the one that makes you forget where you parked your chariot. And if you ever find yourself by a moonlit river, listen closely. There's a story waiting to be told, complete with splashy sound effects, and a cameo by a wise lamb who knows the GPS settings better than your phone. Miriam tucked the soft blanket of night around her shoulders and followed a tiny lantern that bobbed like a mischievous firefly. It wasn't any ordinary bug. Its glow pulsed with an angel's whisper. Casting silver ribbons on the grass, she hummed a sleepy tune, feeling the lantern tug gently, as if an invisible hand were steering a bedtime carousel. The air smelled of pine sap and distant campfires, a comforting perfume that made the stars feel like glittery nightlights. With each step, the world slipped farther from the clamor of daytime, and the lantern's light grew brighter, promising a story worth the yawns. The lantern guided Miriam up a knobby hill where ancient stones hunched like tired grandparents. A cool breeze whispered through the olive trees, rattling dried figs and making the night sound like a lazy sax solo. She could hear a distant brook babbling in a lisp that sounded suspiciously like a bedtime lullaby from a cartoon princess. Above her, the sky flickered with constellations that seemed to wink, as if the universe itself were checking whether anyone had turned off the lights. When she reached the summit, the lantern settled on a smooth rock, its glow spilling over a hidden hollow where the tale of David and Goliath waited to be whispered. In that hollow, a tiny voice rose. David, the shepherd boy with a heart louder than a slingshot, faced a giant the size of a double-decker bus. Goliath's armor clanged like a heavy metal concert. His breath reeked of stale sweat and cheap incense from his war drums. Miriam could almost see the giant's eyes, two dark pits that seemed to swallow sunlight. Yet David's confidence glowed like the lantern itself. The boy's hand steadied on a smooth stone, his fingers brushing the rough surface as if feeling for the perfect note in a song. When the stone flew, it sang a whizzing lullaby that struck Goliath's forehead, and the giant toppled with a thud that rattled the hill like a dropped drum set. The hush that followed felt like a soft blanket being draped over a restless child, soothing every trembling nerve. She realized that courage isn't a roaring lion, but a steady lantern that refuses to dim when darkness presses its cold fingers against the skin. She whispered a gentle lullaby, more hummingbird than rock anthem, into the night, and the melody wrapped around the fallen giant, coaxing his fear into a sleepy sigh. Even the wind seemed to yawn, scattering the dust of bravery like confetti at a surprise party for a shy kid. In that moment, the hill became a stage where the tiniest voice could hush the loudest roar, proving that fear, like a bad Wi-Fi signal, disappears when you close the browser of doubt. The angelic firefly flickered once more, as if giving a wink that said, "Sleep well, brave one." Miriam drifted back down the slope, the lantern's light dimming like sunrise after a late-night movie marathon. She felt the cool earth under her feet, smelled the lingering scent of pine needles and the sweet afterglow of triumph. Her eyes grew heavy, and she whispered a promise to carry the lantern's glow into tomorrow's challenges, even if they were as absurd as a dragon wearing a tutu. And as the night wraps the world in velvet, the story of David and Goliath settled into her dreams, a lullaby of courage that will forever keep the darkness at bay. At the very tip of the craggy hill, the wind howled like a restless fan blowing through an ancient cinema, and the night sky cracked open with a sigh of twinkling light. The summit's stone bench, slick with dew, and a stray goat's droppings, felt surprisingly cool under Miriam's bare feet. Above her, constellations performed a silent dance, their patterns flickering as if someone had switched the cosmic projector to slow-mo. The air smelled of pine sap mixed with the faint, sweet rot of night flowers, a perfume that made her throat tingle. Miriam pulled her cloak tighter, feeling as if the world had just handed her a front row seat to the ultimate celestial show. Out of the ether came a voice as smooth as honey drizzled over fresh bread, the Lord's tone echoing off the cliffs like a bass drop in a gospel rap remix. He began to recount the birth of Jesus, painting the scene of a humble stable that smelled of warm straw, wet wool, and the earthy musk of a newborn's first cry. The narration slipped in a witty aside, noting that even the innkeeper could have used a better Wi-Fi signal to avoid the whole no-room fiasco. As the story unfolded, the gentle clatter of wooden beams and the faint rustle of a mother's shawl filled the night, each sound a soft brushstroke on Miriam's imagination. The Lord's words wrapped around her like a cozy blanket, punctuated by a chuckle that hinted at divine humor. High above the stable, a star blazed with a glow so radiant it could have outshone a Hollywood marquee on opening night, casting a buttery amber wash over the dusty courtyard. The light slipped through the cracks of the stable roof, highlighting the manger's rough bark and the newborn's tiny, pink fingertips clutching a strip of swaddling cloth. Somewhere in the distance, crickets performed a rhythmic chirp, a soundtrack that made the scene feel both holy and oddly like a backyard campfire jam session. Miriam felt the star's heat on her cheeks, a gentle reminder that even the heavens can send a love letter via photon. Miriam's heart fluttered like a nervous hummingbird trapped in a jar of honey, each beat syncing with the star's pulsing brilliance. The voice of the Lord rose, sprinkling hope like confetti at a surprise birthday party, and Miriam laughed soft, surprised, a sound that mingled with the night wind's sigh. She imagined herself as a modern-day Mary, except her only miracle involved finding parking at the summit's tiny lot without a ticket. The scent of fresh bread from a distant bakery wafted up, mingling with the incense of frankincense, creating a scented cocktail that made her eyes water pleasantly. In that moment, the irony of a world so noisy suddenly fell silent, as if the universe pressed the mute button just for her. Finally, the voice crescendoed, and the stars' glow lifted to a crescendo that made the whole valley feel like it was wrapped in a warm, glowing shawl. Miriam's chest swelled with a love so fierce it could have knocked over a statue of Zeus. Yet it was soft enough to lull a restless child to sleep. The night sky, now a velvet canvas dotted with glitter, whispered promises of peace, as if the cosmos itself had taken a deep, contented breath. She tucked the story into the folds of her mind, feeling the gentle tug of hope tugging at the very ends of her soul, like a string of Christmas lights being pulled taut. With a final sigh, she drifted into sleep, cradled by the star-strewn summit and the divine lullaby of love. Miriam slipped back into the meadow, as if the earth itself had opened a welcome mat just for her. The grass brushed her ankles, cool and damp, smelling faintly of wild mint, and the distant churn of a river. Beside her lay the glowing lamb, its fleece shimmering like a soft lantern that had borrowed light from the sunrise. She lowered herself onto the dewy hill, the soft thud of her cloak echoing like an ancient drumbeat. Even the fireflies blinked in rhythm, as if the night were composing a prelude to a story she was about to hear. The lamb's gentle glow coaxed the old tales from the shadows, each one slipping onto the meadow like a silk thread. Miriam heard the whisper of Noah's Ark creaking under a torrent of rain, the smell of wet wood and fish slime tickling her nose. She smelled the incense of the temple, the sharp tang of burnt offering mingling with the sweet of figs from a nearby orchard. Every narrative folded into the next, weaving a blanket as soft as the lamb's fleece and as sturdy as King David's harp. Even the stubborn goat, perched like a grumpy sidekick, snorted a laugh that sounded suspiciously like a sitcom laugh track. Night thickened, draping the sky in a velvety indigo that swallowed the last star like a shy child taking a bedtime snack. Crickets chirped a syncopated lullaby, their legs scraping the earth like tiny percussionists in a gospel choir. A distant owl hooted, its voice low and gravelly, reminding Miriam that even the wisdom of Solomon could be delivered with a touch of midnight gravel. The wind tugged at the meadow's tall reeds, rustling them into a sigh that smelled of pine sap and the faint, metallic bite of evening dew. Miriam felt each story settle onto her shoulders, warm as a wool sweater, heavy enough to anchor her, but soft enough to lull. She chuckled, thinking how the Exodus saga felt like a massive road trip, except the GPS kept shouting, "Turn left at the Red Sea." The lamb, unfazed, blinked its luminous eyes like a Netflix app, waiting for the next episode to load. Even the moon seemed to poke fun, its crescent grin resembling a cheese slice left out too long on a kitchen counter. A sudden gust brought a whiff of goat cheese and burnt incense, the sort of olfactory cocktail that would make a medieval chef both proud and nauseous. Miriam's laughter rose, echoing across the meadow, and the stories giggled back, as if they'd just heard a joke from a prophet with a punchline. Finally, the meadow's chorus softened, and Miriam's eyelids fluttered like moths drawn to a candle that had finally burned low. The lullabies of Abraham, Moses, and Mary wrapped around her like a comforting shawl stitched with starlight. She sank deeper into the earth, feeling the cool soil hug her spine. The scent of night-blooming jasmine seeping into her dreams. Even the glowing lamb exhaled a warm sigh, its light dimming to the hue of a bedtime story told in a dimly lit cave. With a smile that felt like a blessing, Miriam drifted into a slumber so serene that even the heavens seemed to pause and listen. As the sun sank behind the ragged hills of Judah, a rosy glow spilled over the thatched roofs of the village, turning the stone lanes into amber rivers. The scent of freshly baked barley, bread, mingled with the lingering smell of goat dung, a combination that could make even a Roman legionary wince. In the center of the town square, Eliam the scribe, ink-stained fingers twitching, stood beside Miriam, the village's wise elder, whose laugh was louder than a market vendor's hawk. Mothers dragged sleepy toddlers, fathers brushed ash from their sleeves, and the restless children chattered like sparrows after a storm. Together, they waited for twilight to drape the world in its first evening light, the moment when stories could slip from the day's grind into the night's hush. Eliam unfurled a cracked leather scroll, its fibers smelling of dust and desert winds, and announced, "Tonight we brew a ritual to calm the heart, not just the belly." He gestured to the fire pit where embers crackled like a playlist of ancient drums, sending up a puff of smoky perfume that made the children's noses wrinkle. "We've been tossing and turning like Phil Collins on a roller coaster," he joked, and a few mothers snorted, wiping tears of mirth from their eyes. Miriam added, "A story before sleep is the original Netflix binge, only it doesn't require a subscription." The crowd, half skeptical and half curious, leaned in as the first candle flickered, casting shadows that danced like mischievous sprites on the walls. Miriam began with the tale of Jonah, the reluctant prophet who fled a big fish like a teenager, dodging a Zoom call, her voice rising and falling with the wind's sigh. She described the salty spray that clung to Jonah's skin, the fish's gurgling belly that smelled like a soggy sandal, and the darkness that pressed in tighter than a cramped subway carriage. The listeners gasped as the prophet's prayers rose, the words echoing off the stone walls and wrapping the villagers in a warm, invisible blanket. Eliam, ever the dramatist, punctuated the story with a dramatic hand flourish that sent a stray chickadee flapping into the crowd, prompting a chorus of surprised shrieks and giggles. By the time the tale ended, even the youngest child's eyes drooped, his restless energy sinking like a stone in a calm pond. The ritual continued with a softer parable, the Good Shepherd, whose gentle crook glided through the night like a Jedi's lightsaber, guiding lost lambs home. Miriam's words painted the scent of pine needles and the low moan of night goats, a soundtrack that made the adults' throats relax and the children sigh in content. As the story wove, the fire's crackle softened to a whisper, and the distant hoot of an owl sounded like a distant, dignified applause. Eliam handed out bundles of barley seed, each grain cool and slightly gritty between the fingers, encouraging families to close their eyes and imagine planting hope in their dreams. The whole square settled into a hush, the only movement being the slow rise and fall of breath, as if the night itself were inhaling and exhaling in tandem with them. When the final line faded, Miriam lifted her hands, and the twilight sky glittered with stars, a celestial curtain call that made even the most skeptical elder grin. The villagers rose, stretching like cats after a nap. Their hearts beat a little slower. The earlier restlessness now dissolved like soap suds in a rainstorm. Eliam tucked away his scroll, muttering that the night's narrative was more effective than any potion brewed in the alchemist's lab. As they trudged home, the scent of cooling embers lingered, mixing with the sweet perfume of night jasmine, a reminder that stories could soothe skin, soul, and even a stubbornly stubborn goat. And so, under the first evening light, the village discovered that a bedtime parable was the ancient equivalent of a bedtime playlist. Only it required no Wi-Fi, just a willing ear and a willing heart. Miriam settled the children onto the low stone bench as the sun bled orange behind the olive grove, and began the beloved tale of the wandering shepherd. She pulled a rough-hewn staff from the earth, its pine scent mixing with the lingering smell of goat cheese from the market stalls. In a voice that cracked like old parchment, she described how one tiny lamb strayed from the flock, leaving 99 content to graze. The kids leaned in, eyes wide like freshly baked figs, while the wind rattled the thatch roof, as if the very night wanted to hear the story. Even the village cat paused its midnight prowling to listen, tail flicking in curiosity. At dawn the shepherd, a wiry man with a beard as tangled as vineyard vines, shouted goodbye to his herd and set off on craggy hills, leaving the bulk of his flock, humming a low, bleating chorus. He trudged through thorny brambles that scratched his hands, the scent of damp earth rising with each step like a wet wool sweater. The moon, a shy silver coin, slipped behind clouds, forcing him to navigate by the glimmer of fireflies, tiny green lanterns that seemed to tweet, "Where's Waldo?" In the night, he muttered jokes about missing a Netflix binge, grumbling that sheep watching isn't as thrilling as binge watching. Yet his heart hammered louder than any drum, driven by the thought of that single, shivering, woolly runaway. When the shepherd finally spotted the rogue sheep tangled in a thicket of thorns, the animal bleated like a squeaky toy, its breath smelling of pine resin and fear. He untangled the ewe with hands slick from mud, spilling a few beetles onto his boots, a crunchy reminder that nature doesn't care for neatness. As the lamb nuzzled his cheek, the shepherd whispered a promise louder than a karaoke bar. "You're not just a snack for the wolves. You're the star of my bedtime story." The children giggled at the image of a shepherd hugging a sheep tighter than a superhero hugging a sidekick. The scene glowed with a warm amber light from a lantern, casting shadows that danced like medieval memes across the hillside. Back in the village, Miriam let the tale settle like cool mud on the children's shoulders, then asked, "What does a lost sheep teach us about bedtime?" The kids answered with earnest seriousness, claiming that even the tiniest heart deserves a nighttime hug, not just a blanket. Miriam chuckled, noting that the shepherd's search was as relentless as a mother scrolling through endless streaming options, yet far more caring. She urged each child to whisper a gentle "you're safe" to their own imaginary lambs before the candle flickered out. The air filled with the sweet scent of lavender incense, a calming perfume that soothed restless limbs and turned yawns into soft sighs. From that night on, the village treated bedtime like a sacred council, where elders gathered to recount the lost sheep saga, while the fire crackled like an old vinyl record. Parents tucked their youngsters in with the same reverence they'd use to crown a king, promising that no soul would ever be left wandering in the dark. Even the rowdy tavern keeper, notorious for shouting "last call" at dusk, softened his voice, murmuring, "Sleep tight, little lambs, the shepherd's on his way." The ritual spread like fresh dough, rising in every household, and the once gruff sighs of the night turned into lullabies that could make even a stone statue snore. And so, the ancient parable stitched itself into the very fabric of evening, reminding everyone that a gentle reassurance is the true treasure of dusk. When the fire crackled beneath the ancient sycamore, Eliam leaned in and whispered Joseph's dream as if it were a secret recipe for nighttime courage. The air smelled of roasted figs, and a faint, earthy musk from the nearby riverbed, while children shuffled in their woolen sandals, shivering at the thought of darkness. Eliam's voice rose over the murmurs, painting a sky where the sun, moon, and even the stubborn stars bent low like tired servers at a royal banquet. He chuckled, noting that even the brightest lead lamp of a future century would look pale beside a celestial bow. The crowd leaned closer, their lanterns flickering, ready to have their fear of night shaken like a dusty old scroll. In Joseph's vision, the sun, bold as a lion on a throne, stretched a golden hand toward the earth, then gracefully bowed, its rays turning into a gentle curtain of silk. The moon, shy and silvery, followed with a sigh, its pale light slipping like melted butter on warm bread. Even the stubborn stars, those tiny glittering gossipers, tumbled down in reverence, twinkling like confetti at a wedding reception. Eliam laughed, comparing the scene to a Marvel showdown where Thor, Loki, and the Guardians all took a collective knee. Except here, there were no capes, just celestial humility. The dream glowed in the listeners' minds, a vivid theater of light doing a respectful curtsy. The village elders, whose faces were as weathered as ancient stone, frowned at the idea of night bowing, muttering about wolves and the smell of damp soil that seeped into their blankets. Their voices crackled like old parchment, warning that darkness was a hungry beast that swallowed hope whole. Yet Joseph's dream flipped the script, turning night from a monster into a polite guest, waiting to be served a promise of sunrise. A young mother whispered, "If the stars can lean, maybe my baby can finally sleep through the night without screaming like a rock concert." The crowd's tension dissolved into a chorus of chuckles, as if the darkness itself had misplaced its scary costume. Eliam seized the moment, declaring that faith is the candle that refuses to sputter, even when the wind howls like a banshee. He described how the bowing lights whispered, "We will rise again," a promise louder than any war drum beating in the desert dunes. The scent of incense rose, mingling with the cool breeze that carried the distant howl of jackals, reminding everyone that even the most unsettling sounds can be part of a grand lullaby. With a wink, Eliam compared the nightly ritual to binge watching a superhero series. You know the darkness will end, and the hero, here, the sun, always returns for the finale. The listeners felt a warm glow in their chests, as if a hidden fire had been stoked inside each heart. As the fire dwindled to embers, Eliam concluded that bedtime isn't just a pause for the body, but a ceremonial bow to the night's fleeting grace. He urged families to tuck their children in with a story of Joseph's dream, letting the scent of fresh bread and the soft rustle of linen become their own nighttime oath. The crowd laughed, noting that even modern kids with iPads would appreciate a tale where the universe does a curtsy. No Wi-Fi required. With one last grin, Liam reminded them that every darkness carries a promise of sunrise, just like every superhero film guarantees a triumphant ending. The villagers slipped away, their shadows lengthening, but their steps were lighter, as if they carried a pocketful of starlight. The night sky ripped open like a torn veil, hurling rain that slapped the thatched roofs with a relentless drum. Lightning crackled, turning the wind into a howling banshee that rattled every wooden beam. In the village square, the elders hunched beneath a flickering lantern, eyes glittering with the memory of Moses' burning bush. Their voices rose over the storm, calling the ancient tale like a battle cry against the tempest. Even the stubborn goats seemed to pause, ears perked as if awaiting divine Wi-Fi. One by one, families shuffled in, dripping mud into the doorway and shedding drenched cloaks like wet snakes. The elders gathered them around a low stone altar where a pot of fragrant herbs smoked, filling the air with rosemary and the faint scent of burnt parchment. They whispered the parable of the fiery shrub, each syllable a warm ember against the cold gusts. Children giggled, mimicking the crackle of fire with squeaky toy swords, while the oldest men muttered prayers that sounded like a low bass remix of a Gregorian chant. The crowd inhaled the incense, feeling the heat spread from nostrils to marrow. When the final verse fell, the villagers lifted their hands, palms trembling like jellyfish caught in a storm drain. Their chants rose in unison, a chorus that could have startled a Marvel superhero back to his cape. The rain seemed to hesitate, droplets pausing mid-fall, as if waiting for a cue from the heavens. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the burning bush painting on the wall, its colors vivid as a neon sign, and the people swore they smelled cinnamon sugar beside the fire. Laughter erupted when a stray chicken strutted through the circle, its feathers slick and shiny, earning a hearty, holy cluck from the crowd. The ritual steadied trembling hearts, turning panic into a steady drumbeat that matched the rain's rhythm. Each participant felt a strange warmth spreading from their chests, like a covert heater under their coats, reminding them of Moses' awe-inspiring blaze that never burned the bush. Irony winked at them. A story about a fire that didn't consume now protected them from a storm that threatened to drown. The elders, eyes bright with mischief, joked that even Zeus would RSVP to such a party if he had a calendar app. As the wind softened, the village smelled of wet earth mixed with the faint perfume of hope. When the storm finally sighed and withdrew, the villagers lingered, shaking out their slick robes and sharing soggy loaves of bread. The firelight danced on their faces, casting shadows that told new stories of bravery and communal stubbornness. Children begged for another retelling, promising to memorize the verses faster than a tick-tock trend. The elders smiled, knowing the night's parable had sewn an invisible thread of resilience through the village tapestry, and as the last ember faded, the night air carried a lingering scent of pine and promise, a reminder that even in darkness, a burning bush can light the way. The storm finally broke, leaving the thatched roofs slick with rain, and the fields smelling of wet earth and pine sap. Villagers emerged from their mud-caked huts, shivering, yet smiling, as the sky turned a bruised purple twilight. Old Mara, who could recite a psalm faster than a Spotify playlist, declared that the quiet after the tempest was a gift. She gathered the children around the communal fire pit, its flames licking the damp stone like a reluctant cat. In that flicker, the first whisper of a new evening ritual rose, and they called it the dawn of quiet. Each night, as the sun dropped its golden curtain, the villagers lit tallow candles, their waxy glow battling the lingering chill. The air filled with the sweet perfume of rosemary and the sour bite of goat cheese left out to ferment. Mara began to spin tales from the scriptures, her voice rolling like a rolling stone, punctuated by the occasional squeak of a mouse in the rafters. The kids snuggled into wool blankets, eyes wide, while the elders muttered prayers that sounded like a low bass remix of ancient hymns. Even the village dog, Fido, seemed to understand, perching solemnly as if he were attending a Sunday sermon. The parable of the mustard seed became a comedy sketch, with tiny peas sprouting like pop-up ads on a farmer's screen. When the story of the prodigal son turned into a slapstick reunion, the drunk miller pretended to stumble home carrying a sack of bread, only to spill it on his own feet. Laughter rolled through the courtyard, mixing with the crackle of firewood and the distant hoot of an owl that sounded suspiciously like a late-night DJ. Yet beneath the jokes, the moral nestled like a warm ember, reminding each listener that forgiveness is cheaper than a broken pot. The villagers learned to balance reverence with rib tickling, proving that holy lessons could be served with a side of giggles. Months turned into seasons, and the nightly rite seeped into the very marrow of the village. Like moths to a flame, they couldn't resist. Grandmother Leela, whose hair smelled of lavender and mischief, taught her grandchildren to recite the Beatitudes while balancing on a wobbly stool, much to the delight of the tavern's barkeep. Travelers passing through whispered that the village's evenings felt like binge, watching a series of moral dramas, except the subtitles were sung by crickets. Even the blacksmith, who hammered steel with a rhythm akin to a heavy metal drum solo, began to chant prayers between blows, his anvil echoing like a bass drum. Thus, the biblical stories marched forward, hand in hand with candied anecdotes, stitching the past to the present. As the candles burned low, the villagers bowed their heads, feeling the weight of centuries settle like dust on a well-worn tabletop. They thanked the storm for clearing the air, the fire for warming their bones, and the parables for giving their restless nights a purpose. In the hush that followed, you could hear the soft sigh of hay, the distant moo of a cow, and the faint echo of a child whispering, "Good night," like Noah, but with fewer animals. The dawn of quiet had become more than a ritual. It was a living tapestry, woven with humor, faith, and the occasional goat cheese aroma. And so, every night, the village slept under a sky stitched with stories, dreaming of tomorrow's tale, while the wind hummed a lullaby only they could hear in the moon-slick alleys of ancient Shiloh. The night smells like hot oil and burnt barley. Eliam, a lanky scribe with ink-stained fingertips, hears the clatter of sandal-soled priests calling his name. The priestess Miriam, draped in violet robes that whisper louder than the wind, summons him to the courtyard where torches gutter like nervous fireflies. She gestures toward the crowd, whose faces are twisted in a mix of curiosity and dread. As the night itself seems to lean in, listening. "Come quickly," she hisses. "The dreams have begun to crawl out of the shadows, and they need a record before they evaporate like morning mist." By the time Eliam reaches the stone dais, a murmur ripples through the villagers like a bad rumor about a missing goat. Mothers clutch their swaddling blankets tighter, while old men spit out kernels of wheat, muttering that the night has become a restless Instagram story of omen after omen. The first dream unfurls, a river of blood-red sand flowing through the marketplace, washing away stalls and scent of fresh figs. Another recounts a colossal serpent made of wheat stalks, coiling around the city gates, hissing a syllable that sounds oddly like LOL in a forgotten tongue. Everyone leans forward, eyes wide, as the air thickens with the sour tang of fear and burnt incense, waiting for the priestess to decode the chaos. Miriam strokes her chin, a motion that would make a seasoned detective jealous, and declares that nightly visions are not just folklore, but a sacred ledger written in sleep. She explains, with the gravitas of a Marvel director unveiling a sequel, that the community must treat each dream as a divine meme, brief, puzzling, and potentially viral. Eliam rolls his eyes, recalling the last time he tried to catch a dream. It slipped away like a slippery fish at a market, leaving only a damp, fishy smell on his pillow. Undeterred, he cracks his reed pen, feeling the rough wood against his palm, and vows to trap the nocturnal whispers before they dissolve into the night static. The crowd watches, half amused, half terrified, as the scribe dips his nib in ink that smells like crushed olives and fresh rain. The candlelight flickers, casting jittery shadows that dance like jitterbugging teenagers on a Roman fresco. Liam scribbles feverishly, each line a tightrope walk between holy reverence and sheer absurdity, as he notes a dream where the sun turned into a giant, blinking cursor demanding, "Update your faith, please." The ink drips, forming tiny rivers that seep into the parchment, making the page feel as moist as a wet bazaar floor after a sudden downpour. Miriam watches, half smirking, realizing that the divine may have a sense of humor after all. Who else would send a dream about a choir of goats singing Bohemian Rhapsody? Around them, the wind whistles through the olive trees, carrying the faint scent of burnt goat cheese, and reminding everyone that even sacred tasks can be as messy as a toddler's art project. As the last line dries, a hush settles over Shiloh, louder than the clanging of the temple bells at dawn. The priestess folds the scroll, her eyes glinting like polished obsidian, and whispers that the night itself is speaking, asking whether the people will listen or simply scroll past. Liam feels a chill crawl up his spine, as if a phantom hand had brushed his shoulder, reminding him that divine meaning often hides in the gritty details of scent and sound. The crowd disperses, some chuckling at the goat choir, others staring at the sky, wondering if the next dream will involve a flying carpet audition for a Hollywood blockbuster. In that whispering night, the city learns that visions are not just messages from the heavens, but also mirror reflections of their own fever, dreamed hopes and fears, waiting to be transcribed for posterity. Night fell over the hilltop town of Shiloh like a heavy wool blanket, and the distant clang of foreign swords rattled the air like a busted accordion. Liam, a grizzled scribe with more ink stains than hair, stared at the flickering campfire and felt the smell of roasted goat mingling with the bitter scent of dread. Beside him, Miriam, whose laughter could coax olives from the stone, clenched her prayer shawl as a storm of ominous clouds rolled in, whispering of armies marching like a badger's herd in an infomercial. The townsfolk huddled in their mud brick homes, eyes wide, waiting for the night to reveal its secrets. The first dream crashed into Liam like a battering ram made of sand. He saw a river of blood spilling from the city walls, the metallic tang hitting his nostrils as if the very air were rusted. Soldiers in bronze helmets clanged, their shields glinting like the chrome rims of a 1970s muscle car, and a towering horned beast roared, its breath smelling of burnt incense and sweat. He awoke with his heart thudding, a cold sweat slick on his back, and the echo of the dream lingered like a stubborn chorus of war drums. Miriam's vision followed, drenched in irony, and the faint scent of pine sap from a forgotten altar. She stood in a bustling market where a trusted merchant, who always wore a cape like a superhero, suddenly turned his cloak inside out, revealing a hidden dagger that glittered like a disco ball. The crowd gasped, the smell of spiced figs turning sour as the betrayal unfolded, and a stray goat bleated the soundtrack to her terror, as if the universe had cued a sitcom laugh track. She woke, clutching her shawl, half amused that her prophetic Netflix binge had become reality. The people of Shiloh swayed between faith and fear like a candle in a wind tunnel, their prayers rising in a chorus that sounded half like a choir and half like a protest chant. Eliam muttered curses at the heavens, his voice cracking like an old lyre, while Miriam whispered verses that rolled smoother than honey over stone. Children giggled at the absurdity of dreaming of battle armor that smelled like old cheese, their laughter cutting through the tension like a sharp sword through parchment. Yet every hushed breath carried a question. Would these nocturnal warnings be prophecy, or just the brain's way of reheating yesterday's worries? As dawn cracked open the sky, the town gathered beneath a sky painted in bruised purples, the smell of dew-wet soil rising like fresh coffee. Eliam, still shaking, declared the dreams a warning, his words booming like a town crier shouting at a football crowd. Miriam, with a grin that could light the darkest bunker, urged the people to trust the visions and press forward, promising that even if the enemy wore helmets shaped like giant beanies, faith would outshine any armor. The crowd, galvanized by the twin fire of terror and hope, marched toward the looming threat, their steps echoing the drum roll of destiny that had begun in the night's restless theater. Under a bruised violet sky, the courtyard of the Temple of Ephraim buzzed with the crackle of torches and the sour tang of spilled wine. Eliam, the youngest of the prophetic cohort, stood by a basin of oil, his eyes still foggy from a dream that clung to him like wet wool. A trio of grizzled seers, Mordecai, Seraphine, and the wiry Nahum, stepped forward, their voices grinding like sandpaper on stone. They demanded proof that Eliam's night vision wasn't just a divine prank or a late-night Netflix binge of apocalyptic fantasies. The crowd leaned in, their breath a humid fog, as the challenge hung heavier than the incense smoke. Mordecai thrust a rusted scroll into Eliam's hands, its edges frayed like an old vinyl record, and snarled, "Show us the ancient code, or return to your mother's kitchen and dream of dumplings." Seraphine laughed, a sound that rattled the bronze chimes above, and added, "Your visions better come with footnotes, or we'll send you to the desert to wrestle a camel." The rivalry sparked like a firecracker, and Eliam felt his heart thrum against his ribs, a drumbeat of both fear and fierce resolve. He glanced at the crowd, noting the flicker of candlelight on sweaty foreheads and the metallic scent of iron from a recently sacrificed lamb. With a grin that bordered on mischief, he declared he'd dig into the oldest layers of dream lore, even if it meant crawling through dust-filled crypts that smelled like mildew and old cheese. That night, Eliam slipped through shadowed arches into the archive, a labyrinthine vault where scrolls lay stacked like towering Jenga blocks. He brushed his fingers across vellum that crackled like dry leaves underfoot, inhaling the musty perfume of centuries old ink and spider silk, pulling a tattered codex titled Visions Antiqui. He uncovered illustrations of roaring lions, blooming lilies, and a surprisingly detailed doodle of a chariot that looked suspiciously like a 1970s muscle car. Each image pulsed with symbolism. A lion roared to warn of tyranny, lilies whispered of purity, and the car crashed into the interpretation, hinting at humanity's timeless love-hate affair with speed and power. Eliam's mind raced, connecting these motifs to the recent dream of a shattered throne, realizing that the ancient symbols were less static than a Netflix series reboot. Digging deeper, Eliam consulted oral traditions whispered by wandering nomads who still remembered the taste of desert sand on their tongues. He heard a tale of a shepherd who dreamed of a river of honey that turned sour, a story that stunk of rot, yet shimmered with divine warning. The elders explained that dreams were layered like an onion. The outer scent, often sweet or scary, masked deeper, sometimes pungent truths about community, power, and betrayal. Eliam visualized the onion, its skin peeling under his fingertips, each layer releasing a different aroma. Frankincense, burnt offerings, and the unmistakable stench of a dead goat that had been sacrificed in haste. By the time dawn painted the walls gold, he had woven these threads into a tapestry rich enough to satisfy even the most skeptical prophet. When the seers gathered again, Eliam unfurled his findings like a medieval scroll meets a superhero movie poster. He narrated the dream's anatomy, sprinkling in jokes about the ancient chariot's horsepower. Think of it as the original Fast and Furious, but with sandals. And the audience chuckled despite their solemn robes. Mordecai, eyes flickering like a candle in a windstorm, finally nodded, admitting that the authenticity of Eliam's vision was as solid as the stone altar under their feet. Seraphine smiled, whispering that the true contest had never been about who could out-profit the other, but about digging through the gritty, fragrant layers of history to find the heart of a nighttime vision. As the torches sputtered out, the courtyard echoed with the the soft rustle of scrolls, the lingering perfume of incense, and a collective sigh that felt like a dream finally waking up. The palace courtyard smelled of burnt incense and stale goat cheese, a pungent reminder that even sacred ceremonies could go off track. That night, King Melizios tossed his crown on the cold stone floor and fell into a sleep so deep the castle mice stopped scurrying, as if waiting for a plot twist. In his dream, a colossal river of honey flowed backward, dragging a golden chariot that whispered, "Take the hidden road, or your kingdom will become a footnote in history." He jolted awake, heart hammering like a war drum, while a bewildered footman muttered, "Did the king just get a Groupon for salvation?" The vision mirrored the legendary dreams of Joseph and Daniel, but with a splash of modern absurdity. Think a biblical Netflix binge. Morning light filtered through stained glass shutters, painting the throne room with a kaleidoscope of holy colors, and dust motes that danced like reluctant disco balls. The king summoned his advisors, whose beards were as tangled as the scrolls they guarded, and demanded an explanation for the sweet, sticky omen. One sage, half asleep himself, suggested the river of honey meant the enemy would be lured by the scent of riches, a notion that smelled of both genius and stale olives. Laughter erupted when a jester quipped, "So we just follow the honey trail and hope the bees don't sting us." Yet the king's brow furrowed, for the dream's urgency tasted like bitter coffee on his tongue. The council debated longer than a Sunday market bargain, while outside the courtyard rats gnawed on discarded figs, their squeaks echoing like a low-budget soundtrack. Suddenly, a hidden alcove in the palace wall creaked open, revealing an ancient map etched in basalt, its ink glimmering with a faint, oily sheen. The map traced a clandestine canyon known only to shepherds and smugglers, a shortcut the kingdom's enemies had dismissed as myth. As the king traced the route with a trembling finger, he felt a surge of ironic gratitude toward the dream, its absurd imagery, now a strategic GPS. He declared, with the solemnity of a film director yelling, "Action," that they would march at dawn through the secret path. The army clanked out of the palace gates, armor clanging like a heavy metal band on tour, while the cooks tossed spiced stew into cauldrons that hissed like angry serpents. Soldiers marched through mud that smelled of wet leather and desperation, their boots squelching in rhythm with the distant roar of the river of honey, now a metaphor, not a literal flood. When they reached the hidden canyon, a flock of startled doves erupted into the sky, their wings flapping like a frantic applause trailer for an epic sequel. The king, wielding his royal scepter like a lightsaber, cut a path through thorny vines, each slash accompanied by a satisfying crack, as if the very earth approved of his decisive swagger. By nightfall, the enemy camp lay exposed, bewildered by the sudden appearance of a royal contingent that seemed to have teleported from a video game cheat code. The victory was celebrated with a feast that overran the palace kitchens, spilling wine that glimmered like liquid amber across marble floors, and the scent of roasted lamb mingled with the lingering aroma of honey from the king's dream. Scholars scribbled furiously, noting how the nocturnal vision had saved the realm, and they compared the episode to Joseph's coat of many colors. Except this one had more drama than a reality TV reunion. The king raised his goblet, declaring that nighttime revelations were not just divine Wi-Fi signals, but also a reminder that even gods enjoy a good plot twist. As the night waned, the palace mice returned, this time chuckling in their tiny ears, perhaps amused that the kingdom's fate hinged on a dream about sticky syrup. The kingdom's fate pivoted, its people secured, and the sacred trust placed in dreams was validated, proving that sometimes the most profound guidance comes from the kind of crazy, honey-dripping vision that would make even the most stoic prophet say, "Whoa, that's deep." When the last clash of swords faded into the hush of evening, Eliam, scribe with ink-stained fingers, hunched over a rough-hewn table. He lit a modest oil lamp, its flickering light throwing greasy shadows that danced like restless spirits on the walls. The smell of parchment, mixed with the sour tang of wine that had leaked onto the floor, made the room feel like a cellar after a festival. With a grin, Eliam whispered to the empty rafters, "Let's lock these nighttime fantasies into stone before the Sandman steals them again." He began to write, each line a lantern guiding future generations through the dark corridors of memory. He traced how each nocturnal vision stitched itself into Israel's grand tapestry, a pattern as intricate as a Marvel superhero's origin story. From Jacob's ladder that shimmered like a neon billboard in a desert night, to Joseph's vivid cup-filled prophecy, the dreams glowed brighter than a candle-lit Instagram feed. Soldiers in dusty camps swore the scent of frankincense was actually the ghost of a baker's dough rising in the moonlight, a reminder that the divine loves a good whiff of fresh bread. Eliam chuckled, noting that even the stern priesthood could not resist a midnight flicker that felt like a cosmic binge watch of destiny. Thus, each dream became a thread, pulling the community together like a giant, holy patchwork quilt, one that occasionally snagged on a stubborn goat. Night after night, the hills of Judah echoed with murmurs of sleeping armies, the crickets' chirps forming a low bass drumbeat beneath the stars. When a shepherd dreamed of a flaming sword, the air crackled, smelling of ozone and burnt almond shells, as if the heavens themselves were grilling a celestial kebab. Villagers woke to find their doors ajar. A stray goat bleating like a broken saxophone, while the night's visions lingered like a stubborn perfume on the skin. Eliam recorded these oddities, his quill scratching as furiously as a DJ spinning vinyl in a crowded bar, capturing the gritty, soggy reality of dawn after a storm. The chronicler noted that even the most hardened warrior would pause, inhale the cool, damp earth, and wonder whether the dream was a divine warning or just a midnight stomach rumble. Theologically, the dreams served as whispered counsel, louder than any sermon delivered from a marble pulpit. They reminded the priesthood that prophecy could arrive in a humble loaf of barley bread, not just in lofty verses that smelled of incense and old leather. Ironically, the most profound revelations often appeared after a night of drunken revelry, when the wine's spilled floor glistened like a mirror to the soul. Eliam laughed, noting that even the Almighty seemed to have a sense of humor, tossing prophetic riddles like a mischievous cat batting at a dangling yarn. Thus, the community learned to read the night sky as they would a comic strip, searching for the punchline that would steer their fate. With the ink drying, Eliam closed the scroll, feeling the weight of centuries settle like a warm blanket on his shoulders. He imagined future children huddled around flickering campfires, eyes wide as they hear the same nighttime echoes that once rattled soldiers' armor. The lesson glowed clear. Dreams are the country's secret sauce, a spicy blend of hope, fear, and divine sarcasm that flavors every decision. If anyone dares ignore the nightly whispers, they might end up like a camel stuck in a sandstorm, stubborn, bewildered, and smelling faintly of regret. And so the legacy of those visions marches on, marching band drumbeats trailing behind, ensuring that every generation wakes up a little wiser, a little wilder, and always a little more awake to the night's gentle nudges. When the sun slipped behind Jerusalem's ancient stone walls, the sky turned the color of burnt pita, and the narrow alleys exhaled a chorus of clanking pots and gossiping women. Young Eliora, a scribe with ink-stained fingers, hurried past a stall selling roasted chickpeas that smelled like smoky campfires. She paused at the shadowed entrance of the study hall, where twilight flickered like a candle caught in a windstorm. The cool air carried the faint hum of distant prayers, a sound as elusive as a cat sneaking through the marketplace. Eliora felt a shiver, half from the chill, half from the whispered promise of something hidden in the night. Inside, Rabbi Yitzhak welcomed her with a grin that stretched wider than the western wall's sunrise view. He wore a robe that swayed like a Jedi's cape, and his beard, peppered with gray, tickled the hem of his sleeves whenever he laughed. "You look like you've just escaped a sandstorm," he teased, tapping a dusty scroll that smelled of old parchment and goat cheese. Eleonora giggled, her nervousness melting like butter on a fresh flatbread. The rabbi's eyes glittered with mischief as he hinted at a practice most had buried deeper than the city's secret tunnels. The rabbi leaned close, his voice dropping to the hush of a midnight bazaar, and spoke of nighttime prayers that once rose with the moon's glow. He described how the faithful would whisper psalms while the world slumbered, their words curling like steam from a hot bath. Think of it as a spiritual Netflix binge, he said, winking, but without the popcorn and with way more soul fuel. Eleonora imagined a chorus of voices drifting through the dark, intertwining with the night insects' buzz like an ancient mixtape. The idea tickled her curiosity, as if she'd found the secret menu at an old world diner. Yitzhak explained that these prayers stitched a sacred thread between sleep and divine reverence, binding the weary heart to a higher rhythm. He gestured toward the rooftop, where the moon spilled silvery light onto cracked tiles that smelled faintly of rain on stone. When you close your eyes, the Almighty is already humming a lullaby, he declared, his tone half reverent, half sarcastic, as if the heavens themselves were trying to win a karaoke contest. Eleonora felt the irony. People spent all day chasing daylight, yet missed the miracle humming in the darkness. A grin spread across her face. She could almost hear the ancient chant syncing with the city's nocturnal sighs. As the dusk deepened into a velvety black, the rabbi and Eleonora stood side by side, listening to the city exhale its nightly breath. A stray cat darted past, its fur slick with the scent of fish market garbage, reminding them that holiness can coexist with grime. Eleonora whispered a tentative prayer, her voice trembling like a candle's flame in a gusty window. The rabbi nodded, his eyes reflecting the stars that flickered like distant campfires on a desert horizon. In that moment, the forgotten practice found a new home, and the whispering dusk became a bridge between slumbering souls and eternal light. Eleonora lay on the straw mattress of her modest dwelling, eyes glued to the black ceiling, as if it were a fresh scroll waiting for revelation. The night outside the city walls hissed with the rustle of goat skin sandals and the distant clatter of watchmen's wooden staffs. In the flickering lamplight, she could smell the sour tang of goat cheese left unattended, a reminder that even the pantry had surrendered to the darkness. Her mind, however, kept looping around the ancient verse about the night watches, a phrase that felt more like a threat than a lullaby. She sighed, wondering whether the veil of restlessness was a divine test, or simply her own insomnia staging a protest. Across the narrow lane, the neighbors gathered like a conspiracy of nocturnal skeptics, muttering about the dangers that prowled once the sun retreated. They whispered that the night was a realm for demons, not devotions, and that any prayer uttered after dusk risked attracting the very spirits they feared. Their wives clutched talismans shaped like little figs, while the men slammed their fists on the tavern table, sending splinters into the stale ale. A grizzled elder, whose beard smelled of burnt incense and stale bread, scoffed at Eleora's claim that midnight prayers could bring peace. Their collective cynicism cracked like a dry twig under the weight of centuries-old superstitions. Inside her room, Eleora felt the cool breath of stone walls brush her cheek like a mischievous ghost, while the night wind threaded through the cracked window, carrying the scent of wild cumin and distant campfires. Her heart hammered a rhythm akin to a drum line at a wedding. Yet every beat echoed her doubts. Could a whispered psalm really disperse the shadows that seemed to lick the floorboards? She fidgeted with the frayed prayer shawl her mother had sewn, its fabric rubbing gritty against her skin, reminding her of the shepherd's rope that once held flocks together. The candle sputtered, casting jittery silhouettes that danced like nervous teenagers on a school hallway wall. In that uneasy communion of senses, Eleora sensed a tug between ancient reverence and the absurdity of praying. While the world outside smelled like a stew of rot and rain, finally she rose, gripping the prayer book as if it were a secret weapon in a superhero movie where the villain is insomnia. With a half smirk, she muttered, "All right, Night. Let's see if your reputation holds up. Think of me as the original midnight binge watcher," and stepped onto the cold, dust-strewn street. The villagers stared, eyebrows arching like ancient arches, as she raised her voice, letting verses tumble out like a river breaking through a dam. Ironically, the very darkness that the townsfolk feared seemed to lean in, listening to the cadence of her words, while a stray cat slunk past, tail flicking with the indifference of a reality TV judge. Even the wind paused, as if waiting for a commercial break, before resuming its rustle through the olive trees. When the final syllable faded, a hush settled over the courtyard, thick enough to taste like the aftertaste of bitter herbs on a Passover plate. The skeptics exchanged glances, then slowly lowered their arms, the tension in their shoulders easing as if a weight had been lifted from their chests. An elderly woman, whose wrinkled hands still smelled faintly of myrrh, stepped forward and whispered, "Perhaps the night does hold a spark of sanctity after all." Eleora smiled, the tiredness in her eyes softening into a warm glow, feeling the veil of restlessness lift like morning mist over the hills. The night, once feared as a lurking menace, now hummed with a quiet reverence, as if the ancient prayers had rewired the very fabric of darkness itself. The moon hung like a sickle over the dusty lanes of Ein Jetty when a cloaked wanderer slipped into the village square. He carried a tin kettle that clanged like a rusty xylophone, and a single, unlit candle that smelled faintly of goat grease and old incense. Villagers paused their gossip, eyes flickering like fireflies, as the mystic whispered, "I have a light that can talk to the heavens." Eleora, the baker's daughter, felt a shiver that wasn't just the night's chill, and she tugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Even the stray dog, half asleep, lifted its head, as if the stranger's presence were a dropped DVD of an ancient thriller. At precisely midnight, the mystic struck a match, and the candle erupted in a flame that sang, crackling louder than a campfire full of popcorn. The glow spread like spilled honey, turning the cobblestones amber and making shadows waltz in the corners of the tavern's broken windows. With each flicker, a faint scent of cedar and honey roasted figs rose, curling into the air and coaxing the villagers' lungs to inhale reverently. He began a low chant, his voice weaving between the night insects' chirps, and the candle's light seemed to pulse in time, as if it were texting the divine. The crowd felt a ticklish thrill, the kind you get when you discover a secret level in a video game, and they leaned in, hungry for the holy Wi-Fi signal. Eleora, cheeks flushed with flower dust, stepped forward and asked the mystic how a simple wick could open a portal to the sacred. He chuckled. Even a candle can be a Wi-Fi router for prayers, if you know the password, silence, and intention. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, half expecting the candle to sprout wings and fly off like a bewildered pigeon. Yet the humor softened the fear, and the baker's apprentice whispered a prayer about dough rising, causing a few candles to sputter like a nervous teenager at prom. Inspired, the village council gathered around the candle, each cradling a stub of wax from their own hearths, like a medieval potluck of light. They lowered their heads, murmuring the ancient bedtime psalms, while the night air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and a lingering hint of burned olive oil. A shy breeze slipped through the alley, curling the smoke into spirals that resembled tiny constellations, and a stray cat hissed, annoyed by the sudden aromatherapy. Eleora's voice rose, steady as a drumbeat, and the candle's flame flickered in time, as if it were doing a synchronized swim routine with the stars. The sound of distant donkeys braying turned into a percussion section, and even the village idiot shouted, "This is more lit than my last Netflix binge." By the time the hour hand crawled toward 3, the prayer ritual felt as natural as brushing teeth, but with more sparkle and less minty aftertaste. When dawn finally bled pink across the rooftops, the candle sputtered out, leaving a faint soot ring that glowed like a superhero's emblem on the stone floor. The villagers dispersed, each carrying a pocket-sized memory of the night, convinced that their prayers now had a direct line to the divine. No internet required. Eliora laughed, noting that the mystic's tale was better than any blockbuster, because it didn't need special effects, just a wick and a willingness to whisper. The wanderer vanished as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind a single, singed candle stub and the lingering question, who really controls the night, the stars or the stubborn human heart? And so, the village adopted the midnight candle ritual, lighting tiny flames whenever darkness deepened, forever bridging mortal messiness with a flicker of holy humor. When the sun finally gave up the ghost, the ancient hills of Judea turned into a glittering carpet of stars, each pinprick winking like a reluctant celebrity on the red carpet. Hagar's grandchildren shuffled out of their modest homes, clutching wooden bowls as if they were Oscars for the night. The smell of damp earth mingled with freshly baked challah, a scent so honest it could shame a perfume commercial. A murmur rose from the crowd, half prayer, half gossip, about the latest market scandal. Yes, even the prophets liked a good rumor. Under that celestial chandelier, the village assembled for the midnight accord, ready to turn darkness into a holy Wi-Fi hotspot for souls. At the center of the square, a single oil lamp flickered, its wick dancing like a nervous teenager on a first date. The flame steadied just as the rabbi, whose beard could double as a rope ladder, lifted his hands toward the heavens. The oil scent sharp, a bit like a mechanic's garage, cut through the night air, reminding everyone that even sacred moments needed lubrication. People leaned in, eyes bright, while a stray goat, clearly hired for morale, nibbled on a stray loaf, earning a hissed reprimand that turned into a chuckle. The lantern's glow stitched the crowd together, a makeshift constellations map right on the cobblestones. Then, as if the night itself decided to audition for a Broadway show, a gentle breeze slipped through the alleyways, slipping past the shutters and into the prayer circle. It carried with it a soft chorus of voices, some low and gravelly like an old baritone, others high and airy like a tick-tock melody, but all humming the same ancient hymn. The wind brushed against the palms of the worshippers, tingling like a static shock after a too long Netflix binge. Even the stubborn stone walls seemed to sway, their cracks vibrating in sympathy, as if the architecture had RSVP'd to the invitation. Laughter twinkled among the verses, because who could keep a straight face when the divine soundtrack included a distant rooster's alarm clock? By the time the last verse faded, the night had been officially declared a sanctified sanctuary for rest, complete with an unwritten no cell phone policy. though the nearest scrolls still complained about the inconvenience of carrier pigeons. The villagers, heads heavy with the perfume of incense and sweat from a day of tilling, sank onto the soft grass, feeling the earth's cool sigh against their cheekbones. A stray cat, more interested in the leftover crumbs than theology, rolled over, turning the solemn scene into a cat nap montage worthy of a Netflix binge watch. The sense of peace was so thick you could cut it with a knife, or at least with a well-sharpened sickle, and it tasted faintly of honey and the lingering tang of ale. In that moment, even the most chronic insomniac whispered, "Okay, okay, I'm finally getting the memo. Sleep is holy." As the final ember sputtered out, the community rose, stretching like sleepy superheroes, emerging from a 90s sitcom's commercial break. The rabbi winked, promising that tomorrow's sunrise would bring fresh manna, fresh gossip, and perhaps a new scroll about proper goat herding etiquette. The night sky, still glittering, seemed to applaud with a silent fireworks display that would make even modern pyrotechnics blush. With sandals scraping the stone, the villagers drifted back home, their hearts lighter, their dreams already rehearsing the next midnight accord. And somewhere high above, a lone star winked, as if saying, "See you at the next all-night jam session." The first amber thread of sunrise slips over the hills like a shy curtain, and the village of Shalem stirs from its nighttime cocoon. Roosters squawk with the enthusiasm of an overcaffeinated tick-tock dancer, while the scent of damp earth and smoldering firewood tickles tired nostrils. Women pull back woven blankets, revealing hamlets of sleeping figures still tangled in woolen dreams, some with snoring that could rival a malfunctioning engine. A soft chorus of murmured thank yous drifts upward, as if the very air knows it's time to wake the world. Just hours earlier, when the moon hung low and the crickets performed a jitterbug, Eliora knelt beside the stone altar, whispering prayers that smelled of burnt rosemary and stale milk. She clutched a chipped amulet, its surface etched with a simple dove, and begged for protection against the desert's whispering sandstorms. The night wind carried her words like a secret Instagram DM to the heavens, and a hush settled over the camp, so thick you could hear the creak of old wooden doors. In the quiet, a faint glow pulsed around the sleeping heads, a reminder that divine safety sometimes wears the pajamas of ordinary folk. When dawn finally stretched its golden limbs, villagers rose with a vigor that would make a Spartan warrior jealous, shaking off the night's sweat and the lingering scent of incense. Their eyes, still glazed with the remnants of prayerful reverie, widened as the sky painted itself in hues of burnt orange and honey. Children darted through the alleys, laughing like mischievous sprites, while elders rubbed the grime from their faces, muttering, "Did the night really guard us? Or was it just the goats chewing our blankets?" The village square filled with the clatter of wooden carts, the hiss of oil lamps being doused, and the occasional burp from a farmer who'd been dreaming of giant, talking falafel. Eleora, now standing on the threshold of the well, felt her faith solidify like the stubborn crust on a sourdough loaf left too long in the oven. She raised her hands, and the crowd watched, half expecting a bolt of lightning, or at least a dramatic drum solo. Instead, the sun's first rays caught the glint of her amulet, making it sparkle like a pop star's stage outfit, and a chorus of relieved sighs rose from the onlookers. The villagers laughed, noting with irony that the only thing that truly protected them was a good night's sleep and a well-timed prayer. No need for a superhero cape. Word of the sacred sleep spread faster than gossip in a market bazaar, winding its way to neighboring towns, where skeptics tried the midnight prayers and woke to find their sheep mysteriously sheared themselves. Merchants began selling talismans shaped like tiny pillows, branding them with the slogan "Rest like a prophet, awaken like a king." Even the traveling bards started a new ballad, joking that the secret to success was not a sword, but a solid mattress and a prayer that could outrun a Netflix binge. Thus, the tradition of nighttime prayers wove itself into the cultural fabric, stitching together faith, humor, and the simple, gritty reality of village life. When the first hunter-gatherers lifted their eyes from the soot-blackened fire pits, the night sky stretched above like a massive, velvety dome pierced by glittering holes. They whispered stories into the cold air, stitching together the darkness with the same thread they used to tie animal skins together. The stars became pinpricks of destiny, each one a character in a drama that explained why the sun disappeared each evening. In those early evenings, the world felt like a giant theater where the curtain fell, and the actors, wolves, owls, and trembling humans, took the stage. And somewhere between the crackle of burning pine and the distant howl, the first myths of creation were born. One of those myths, the genesis of many cultures, imagined a void so thick you could taste its emptiness like stale bread left out in the rain. Gods or cosmic beings, sometimes a single all-powerful creator, sometimes a chaotic duo, stirred the darkness, pulling light from the ink like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. The first light was a sharp electric snap, followed by a yawning silence that smelled of wet earth and fresh cut timber. As the sky split, the night receded, but it left a lingering chill that reminded people the darkness was still watching from the edges. The story taught early listeners that night wasn't just the lack of light. It was a purposeful, sacred gap in the day's rhythm. Soon after, people began to mark the moon's slow ballet with rituals that smelled of burnt sage and fermented goat milk. They would gather on hilltops when the crescent hung like a thin silver smile, chanting songs that made the night air vibrate like a drumhead. Each phase, new, waxing, full, waning, signaled a different rite. Planting seeds during the new moon's hidden phase, celebrating harvest under the full moon's glowing belly. The rituals were messy, with clumsy dances that sent mud splattering into the starlit grass and laughter that echoed off the rocks. In those cyclic ceremonies, night became a calendar, a living clock that ticked not with gears, but with the soft glow of celestial bodies. Because of those early performances, night earned a reputation as a sacred canvas where the ordinary turned extraordinary, much like a graffiti wall that only appears when the streetlights flicker off. Artists, cave painters, drum makers, storytellers painted shadows with pigments made from crushed beetles and charcoal, the scent of which clung to their hands like a stubborn perfume. The darkness also invited mischief. Trolls whispered jokes about the moon being a giant night light left on by the gods. And the nocturnal critters staged prank raids on sleeping camps, stealing a bite of roasted meat before vanishing into the gloom. Yet beneath the humor, there was a trembling awe, a feeling that the night held secrets thicker than the smoke from 1,000 fires. It was this blend of reverence and ribbing that turned night into a stage where humanity could confront both its fears and its funny bones. Fast forward to today, and the ancient night stories still flicker in movies, video games, and memes. Think of the endless stream of moonlit battle royale streams that glow like modern campfires. We still schedule our lives around the lunar calendar, from Ramadan's fasting nights to the harvest festivals that still light up villages with lanterns and the smell of spiced stew. Even our smartphones, those little glowing talismans, borrow the night's mystery, sending push notifications that feel like tiny nocturnal owls tapping on our windows. The old myths have been repackaged, but the core idea remains. Night is a canvas for meaning, a place where we paint our hopes, fears, and the occasional joke about werewolves. So when you look up at the midnight sky and see a shooting star flash by, remember you're sharing a view that has inspired humanity's most daring tales since the very first fire was lit. When the first nomads huddled around a crackling fire, the night sky unfurled like a black velvet scroll, each glittering point a potential letter. They stared up, feeling the bite of cold air on their cheeks, and whispered, "What story does that dot tell?" Soon enough, the constellations became a living alphabet, a map of myths, warnings, and recipes, like a celestial cookbook etched in starlight. The smell of smoked goat mingled with the smoky perfume of night-blooming desert flowers, sealing those stories into memory. Thus, the heavens turned from indifferent glitter into a bustling newsroom of the gods. The Greeks, ever the drama lovers, painted the night with the exploits of Hercules, Perseus, and a jealous Zeus who kept checking his celestial Instagram. Orion strode across the sky, his belt a cosmic runway for celestial fashion, shows that even Paris would envy. Citizens gathered at the Agora, pointing with wine-stained fingers, deciphering myths that explained why their neighbors stole goats. Their poets sang with a twang that sounded like lyres caught in a gust, turning each star into a punchline or a moral lesson. In that glittering theater, the constellations served as both stage lights and the script guiding sailors out of storms and lovers out of tavern brawls. Deep in the Yucatan jungle, Maya priests traced the Milky Way like a silvery river, its ripples marking the rhythm of maize planting and human sacrifice. The Pleiades, a fluffy cluster of 7 sisters, glowed like a lantern of fireflies, signaling the start of the rainy season, and the annual ball where nobles dressed as jaguar warriors. When the heavens shifted, the priests shouted tune, a word that tasted like bitter chocolate and sounded like a marching drum, reminding everyone that time was a strict teacher. Even the common folk, sitting on thatched huts, could feel the night's cool breath on their backs as they whispered the names of constellations that doubled as calendar reminders. Thus, the stars became an ancient spreadsheet, crunching numbers of crops, wars, and love affairs, all while the cicadas sang a soundtrack that could rival any modern pop chart. Across the Arabian dunes, Bedouin caravans followed the North Star like an over-caffeinated GPS, its steady glow guiding camels weary of sand that smelled of roasted goat and ozone. At night, the wind sang through the tents, a low hum that carried verses about wandering stars, each rhyme as sharp as a scimitar. Elders traced Orion's belt with calloused fingers, turning the pattern into a lesson on hospitality. Share your broth, or the desert will share its sand with you. Children giggled as the constellations morphed into mischievous foxes and sly merchants, their eyes wide with the glow of fire-lit tea. When the moon rose full, its silver light turned the dunes into a sea of moving dunes, and the tribes' songs rose like salty spray, stitching the night into a communal tapestry of identity. From Greek amphitheaters to Maya temples and Bedouin tents, the night sky acted like an ancient Netflix, streaming endless series of heroics, calendars, and moral sitcoms. Navigators consulted these stellar scripts like pilots check their dashboards, trusting that a flickering star won't suddenly drop a spoiler about a lost civilization. Morality lessons twinkled between Orion's sword and the Milky Way's river, reminding us that even the gods liked to drop a moral punchline when you least expected it. Communities gathered under that glittery ceiling, feeling the cool night air on their skin and the faint scent of pine smoke, forging bonds as sturdy as a star-forged shield. So next time you stare up, remember, those points of light are more than just pretty dots. They're the universe's original, unstoppable, and occasionally sarcastic storytellers. When the first city walls rose, night fell like a velvet curtain stitched with fireflies and the occasional waft of goat cheese. Elders gathered around ember-glow hearths, swapping stories that flickered as sharply as the shadows dancing on mud brick walls. Those tales soon stopped being idle gossip. They became weapons, whispered warnings, and rallying cries that could stir a crowd faster than a rooster on espresso. In every corner of the ancient world, darkness proved a potent canvas for power-hungry voices, some preaching hope, others painting monsters in the moonlight. Thus began the long, murky saga we call the shadows of conflict, where nighttime narratives forged both alliances and animosities. In the dusty corridors of Jerusalem's temple, psalmists tapped their lyres, while the night wind hissed through stone arches, carrying verses that sounded like thunder trapped in a scroll. Psalm 91, for example, wrapped the faithful in a cloak of the Almighty's shadow, a promise so comforting that even the city's most jittery night watchmen fell asleep with a smile. Yet other verses crackled with warning. The wicked rise like a storm at midnight, a prophetic sneeze that could chill the blood of a tax collector counting his loot. These prophetic warnings turned nighttime prayers into political grenades, tossed into banquet halls where kings debated war over a bowl of pomegranate stew. The irony. While the Psalms aimed to unite Israel under a divine night watch, their fierce language sometimes split factions faster than a split-screen Netflix drama. Across the jade-clad palaces of the Han, scribes hunched over ink-black bamboo scrolls, cataloging omens that blinked like fireflies above the imperial garden pond. A crimson comet streaking across the moonless sky was logged as heaven's angry eyebrow, a cosmic wink that could justify a coup, or a costly tribute to the neighboring nomads. Courtiers whispered that the scent of sandalwood drifting from the palace kitchens foretold a famine, a sensory rumor that made officials purge inventories with the fervor of a reality TV clean-out episode. When the Zhou dynasty recorded a sudden chorus of frogs croaking in unison, they declared it a warning of rebellion. And the next day, the emperor's favorite horse mysteriously sprouted a limp nature's slapstick punchline. These ominous entries turned night's quiet murmur into a bureaucratic weapon, able to rally troops or silence dissent with the flick of a feathered brush. In the damp stone taverns of medieval Europe, the smell of spilled ale mixed with the smoky stench of lantern oil, setting the stage for fearsome demons to stalk the midnight corridors of the imagination. Villagers swore they saw the Black Shroud, a hulking shadow with eyes like coal-capped lanterns, slipping through thatch roofs, while a choir of unseen crickets kept a morbid rhythm. Priests, keen on boosting attendance, preached that the devil himself liked to binge-watch mortal sins, an ironic reference to the newest, hellish entertainment of the day, storytelling circles that could out-spook a grim fairy. Yet these terrifying tales also served as community glue. When a child vanished, the whole hamlet lit torches, sang hymns, and searched together, turning terror into a group hike through the forest's prickly brush. The result was a paradoxical bond. The more grotesque the nightmare, the tighter the net of shared courage, as if the whole village were starring in their own low-budget horror movie. By the time the Renaissance painted sunrise over the night-scarred past, the world realized that darkness was not just a backdrop for monsters, but a stage where power could strut in high-heeled boots or limbo in tattered cloaks. Modern readers might liken these night narratives to the Marvel Cinematic Universe of ancient propaganda, each hero or villain wielding shadow as a superpower to rally fans or frighten foes. Whether it was a psalm's soothing whisper, a comet's flaming finger, or a demon's guttural growl, each story lit up the night with a different hue, turning fear into fierce fellowship, or fracturing societies like a broken mirror. Today's meme-savvy crowd still trades midnight warnings, swapping doom-scrolling for actual scrolls, proving that even in the age of Wi-Fi, the human itch for nocturnal narrative never dims. So, as we sit under streetlights humming like fireflies in a neon forest, remember, the shadows we cast are both our armor and our antagonist, always ready to unite us or pull us apart with a dramatic flourish worthy of any epic finale. When the final trumpet sounds, the sky folds into a bruised purple dusk that smells of damp earth and ozone. The heavens peel back like an old cinema screen, revealing a battlefield stitched together from the shadows of Genesis and the neon glare of modern apocalypses. Angels in rusted armor clatter down the staircases of clouds, their wings humming like a busted refrigerator. Across the void, a legion of darkness drips like black coffee spilling over stone, tasting of sulfur and old regrets. Every heartbeat of the cosmos thuds in the chest of the onlookers, as if the universe itself were holding its breath for a midnight fireworks show. Light surges forward, a golden tide that crackles mingles with the sound of distant fireworks and the scent of fresh pine after a rainstorm. It recalls the ancient battle of Ra against Apophis, yet wears a hoodie and a selfie stick, reminding us that even deities have gone casual. The darkness retaliates, hurling jagged shards of midnight that clang against the armor of the celestial hosts, echoing the clatter of 1,000 broken swords in Tolkien's doom-laden fields. The clash paints the night with ribbons of fire, turning the heavens into a smoky bar where angels serve divine cocktails and demons sip burnt espresso. Spectators, both holy and heretical, feel the tremor in their bones, a mix of awe, terror, and the weird urge to check their phone for the latest apocalypse meme. The outcome of this twilight showdown casts a long, prophetic shadow over every culture that ever imagined the end of days. In medieval frescoes, artists now swap their humble lambs for lead-lit angels, giggling at the thought that future tourists will snap selfies with them. Street prophets in Lagos whisper that the darkness smells like burnt incense and fried plantains, while New York's Wall Street brokers hear the clink of gold coins melting into starlight. Even the ancient Greeks, who once penned the Iliad, would twitch at the idea of Zeus swapping his thunderbolt for a laser pointer, illuminating the world's final tick-tock dance. Thus, the Revelation's nighttime narrative becomes a cultural DNA strand, threading through movies, video games, and midnight sermons like a glowing worm in the dark. Imagine the final showdown streamed live on a platform called Heaven Flix, with commentary from a sardonic Greek chorus wearing earbuds. The announcer, a deadpan version of Morgan Freeman, declares, "And now, the light is about to level up, no cheat codes allowed." While the darkness mutters, "We have the ultimate plot twist, we're actually the Wi-Fi." Fans in the pews clutch popcorn that smells like melted butter and holy smoke, cheering when a seraph flicks a switch and the night flickers like a faulty street lamp. Meanwhile, a demonic barista serves espresso so strong it could wake the dead, and the smell of burnt coffee mixes with the ozone, creating a fragrance that could only be described as apocalypse chic. The irony is as thick as the fog rolling over the battle, reminding us that even in the end times, humanity can't help but riff on the absurdity of its own myths. When the final flash subsides, the night settles into a quiet that smells of wet stone and the faint, metallic tang of hope. Survivors stand on ash-covered ground, feeling the cool bite of night air against their skin, like a whispered promise that tomorrow might still need a sunrise. They glance up at a sky now stitched with constellations that look suspiciously like emoji laugh-cry faces winking from the void. In that moment, the ancient tale of light versus darkness becomes less a doctrinal verdict and more a punchline that the universe keeps retelling, each time with a new costume change. And so, the twilight apocalypse fades into legend, leaving behind a cultural echo that will haunt songs, films, and the occasional late night meme, forever reminding us that even the end has a sense of humor. When the city lights flicker on like 1,000 fireflies, artists scramble to capture the lingering myths of night. They paint canvases drenched in midnight blues, sprinkle glitter that smells faintly of burnt incense, and whisper about Odin's wandering wolves as if they were street art taggers. In rooftop studios, the hiss of spray paint competes with the distant rumble of subway trains, a symphony of grit and glitter. Even the local coffee shop, with its espresso steam curling like ghostly halos, becomes a shrine to the ancient story of Prometheus stealing fire. Only now it's a latte. The irony. We chase the darkness with neon, yet we still feel the same shiver whenever a moth brushes a bulb. Writers, armed with keyboards instead of quills, resurrect nocturnal epics in paperback and on-screen scrolls. They spin tales of Lilith's midnight rebellion that smell of old paper and fresh rain on concrete, letting readers taste the ozone after a thunderstorm. In book clubs, the clink of wine glasses mimics the chime of distant temple bells as members debate whether the night is a villain or a lover. Instagram poets drop haikus about city shadows while their dogs snore in the background, proving that even a tired pup can be an unwitting muse. The humor lies in how a 2,000-year-old lament becomes a meme captioned, "When you realize the night is just Wi-Fi off." Scientists, those modern alchemists, swap mystic symbols for telescopes, yet they still speak in the language of awe. They map constellations with software that looks like a video game HUD, and the night sky smells of pine sap after a midnight hike, reminding us why ancient hunters stared up for guidance. In labs, the whir of cooling fans mimics the wind through desert dunes where Bedouins once tracked the North Star. When a supernova bursts, the data streams onto screens, flashing like a Vegas marquee that tells a story older than disco. The irony. We calculate the universe's age in seconds, while a kid under a blanket still believes monsters hide under the bed. Festivals now turn night into a runway of light. From neon carnivals in Lagos to midnight movie marathons in suburbia, where Darth Vader's breathing competes with a street vendor's sizzles. The crowd's laughter bounces off walls plastered with graffiti of ancient moon goddesses, their eyes glittering like fresh graffiti cans. In the background, a DJ spins tracks that sample Gregorian chants, proving even monks would have dropped a beat at a rave. Pop culture loves this mashup. Think Game of Thrones meets The Office, when a night shift worker narrates the rise of a dark queen while juggling coffee cups. The scent of fried dough and the echo of distant church bells remind us that darkness isn't merely a backdrop, it's a stage where every culture improvises. All this tells us that the night, like a stubborn houseplant, refuses to wilt even when we flood it with LED glare. It forces us to light candles, stoke fireplaces, and more importantly, kindle imagination, because every darkness hides a promise of sunrise. When the first rooster cracks its dawn-break giggle, we feel a collective sigh of relief, as if the universe just exhaled after a long, smoky night. In this eternal dance of night and light, we discover that our modern myths are merely reflections of ancient whispers, polished by neon and narrated through emojis. So raise a glass to the midnight hour, because even the most stubborn gloom eventually bows to a brand new day.